There was a sealed envelope that no one had opened in over 3 years. It was kept in a safe in a private wing of Windsor that most palace staff know by the hall number but rarely visit. When it was finally opened, on a Tuesday morning by a lawyer who arrived early and left late, what was inside did not bring down the monarchy. He did something that, in some ways, was more disturbing than that. It rewrote Camilla's status within her without anyone needing to raise their voice. Prince Philip signed that document in March 2021, 6 weeks before he died. He had asked a single advisor to prepare it and a single lawyer to witness it, and he had given explicit instructions that the envelope remain closed until the specific conditions outlined in its contents were met. The conditions were met when Charles was crowned in May 2023. The envelope should have been opened that month. For reasons that none of the parties involved have explained publicly, it was not. When it was finally opened in 2025, the effect was immediate and did not allow for negotiation. Before going into the details of what the decree contained and what happened when its contents were communicated to Camilla, it is necessary to understand who Philip was in relation to this specific issue, because the identity of the signatory is what gives the document its particular weight. It wasn't Elizabeth who signed it. It wasn't Charles. He was the man who spent more than 70 years being the cornerstone of the British monarchy, the man who more than anyone else understood the difference between what the crown stands for publicly and what it protects privately. Philip was not a man who acted on impulse. People who worked alongside him for decades describe his decision-making as meticulous, to the point that it was sometimes frustrating to those around him waiting for a quick answer. He studied consequences before acting. He considered precedents. And when he signed something, he signed it because he had come to the conclusion that it was necessary, not because he had been pressured by any direction. The fact that he signed that decree 6 weeks before he died, at a time when he was lucid enough to understand what he was signing, but weakened enough to know that he would not be present to see its effects, says something about the seriousness with which he considered the issue. This was not done in a moment of anger or sentimentality. It was done with the precision of someone taking a final inventory of what needed to be protected after he was gone. The decree had 3 parts. The first established that crown residences, specifically defined as properties belonging to the royal patrimony by historical inheritance and not by personal acquisition of the monarchs, were owned by a line of succession and not by marriage. In practical terms, this meant that access to these residences was determined by a person's position in the dynastic line, and not by the marital bond with whoever occupied the throne. The second part specifically identified which categories of people could not claim the right of permanent residence on the basis of marriage to the monarch without explicit and documented approval from the Privy Council. The third part named the residences to which these restrictions applied. The list was long. It includes Sandringham, which Charles had personally inherited from Elizabeth as private property, and which therefore fell outside the scope of the decree. But it included Windsor Castle, Holyrood House in Edinburgh, and a collection of smaller residences spread across the Crown estate that had been used by senior members of the royal family over generations. For Camilla, who had built part of her public life around access to these spaces, exclusion was not just symbolic. It was functional. The lawyer who opened the envelope was from the legal firm that manages the affairs of the Duchy of Cornwall, the estate that William inherited in September 2022. She had been hired specifically for a review of existing property arrangements within the royal family, not in search of Philip's decree, but in search of inconsistencies between existing records of use and documented rights over these spaces. The decree appeared as part of this broader review, filed accordingly, but never formally communicated to anyone other than the original witness attorney, who had died in 2023. When the lawyer took the document to William, he read it twice without comment. Then he asked her to wait while he made a call. The call went to the king's private secretary. Charles found out that afternoon. The conversation between father and son was not long, according to sources close to the situation, and it was not comfortable for either of them. The king immediately understood what the decree Ato meant, and what needed to be done with it. What made it difficult was not the legal issue, which was clear. It was the personal issue, which was exactly as complicated as anyone in Charles's position would expect it to be. Philip had foreseen this complication. The decree included a clause that specified that its application was automatic upon verification of established conditions, which meant that Charles did not need to make an active decision about implementing it. The decree simply came into force. The only thing the king needed to decide was when and how to communicate the fact to his wife. He waited 4 days. During those 4 days, according to sources familiar with the period, Charles consulted 2 constitutional lawyers privately and separately, without either of them knowing that the other had been consulted. Both reached the same conclusion. The decree was valid. It had been prepared within the correct procedures for documents of this type, and its application did not require further action by the Privy Council, because Philip had structured the document in such a way that it fell within the existing royal prerogative of a senior member of the family over matters of access to property. In other words, Philip had constructed the decree in such a way that no external body needed to approve it. He knew enough about how the monarchy works to understand that anything that required additional approval could be blocked by people with personal reasons to block it, so he didn't ask for approval. He simply acted within an authority he already had. Charles communicated the decree to Camilla on a Sunday night. There were no advisors in the room. There were no staff members on duty. It was a conversation between husband and wife about something that would change what the word residence meant to her within the institution she had entered when she married him. Sources close to the situation describe Camilla's initial reaction as silence, the kind that precedes understanding rather than following shock. She read the document herself. Then he read the list of residences. Then she was very quiet for a period that Charles describes, according to people who spoke to him later, as longer than any silence he had witnessed from her in 20 years. Then she asked a question. He asked if there was anything that could be done. Charles said he had consulted 2 constitutional lawyers and they both said the same thing. She heard this, looked at the document once more, and asked to be left alone. What happened in the following weeks was managed with the discretion that this family reserves for the things it most wants to control, but the practical effects of the decree began to appear in ways that people noticed even without receiving an explanation. Accommodation reservations that had been made for Camilla at various residences throughout the royal calendar were quietly canceled or modified. Certain communications that would normally go through her office have been redirected, and in at least 2 documented cases within the Crown Estate's property management system, her name was removed from access lists she had held since her coronation. No announcement was made, no statement was distributed. To the outside world, Camilla continued to be queen consort, continued to appear alongside Charles in official engagements, continued to be photographed and covered as if nothing had changed, because publicly, nothing had changed. Publicly, she was still who she had been the previous morning, but internally, within the administrative structures that determine where people sleep, where they receive mail, where they are listed as having a right to be, something had changed in a permanent and non-negotiable way. William knew before Camilla was informed. This sequence, father telling his son before telling his wife, says something about how Charles processed the 4 days between receiving the decree and communicating it. He spoke to William first, not because William had legal authority over the matter. The decree worked independently of anyone's approval, but because Charles needed a conversation where he could say out loud what he was doing before he did it. And the person he chose to have this conversation with was the heir, not his wife. William listened. He asked a few questions about the legal details to ensure he understood the scope correctly. And then he said something that, according to sources close to the prince, Charles carried with him as he waited for the 4 days, that a decision made by Philip before he died was a decision that had been made with all the time and all the clarity available to a person in that circumstance, and that it deserved to be treated as what it was. Charles understood what his son was saying. And in the morning of the sun, when he finally communicated the decree to Camilla, he had that phrase somewhere in his head as he watched her read the document for the first time. The question of how Catherine received this information is more complicated to reconstruct. Sources close to the situation suggest that William told her after her conversation with Charles, and that the Princess of Wales processed the news with the quietness that characterizes her when she receives something that has implications that have yet to be fully understood. She didn't celebrate. People who know her well say she's not the kind of person who celebrates when someone loses something, regardless of who that person is or what was lost. What she understood immediately was the long-term implication. With the decree in place, the question of where Camilla would live after Charles died, a question that had hung over them all without ever being openly discussed, had received a partial answer that no one had asked for, but that everyone now needed to incorporate into future planning. Anne found out from William, not Charles. This distinction is relevant because it means that there was a time when the two brothers communicated about the decree before the king had told Camilla, which indicates that the network of communication within the family on this matter did not follow the most obvious hierarchy. Anne listened, asked few questions, and said only that Philip had understood the need before anyone else was willing to look at it. That remark, according to sources familiar with the conversation, was the most honest any family member made about the decree. Philip had understood that the question of residency status for spouses of non-bloodline monarchs was an issue that needed to be resolved clearly before ambiguity became a problem. He had seen what happens within this institution when questions of law and status are left open, when custom replaces documentation and affection replaces protocol. And he had used the last 6 months of his conscious life to close one of those questions in a way that no one could easily reopen. The decree was not an act of hostility against Camilla. Philippe had done this because he believed clarity would benefit the institution, not because he had any desire to harm the woman his son had chosen, but the clarity that the decree produced inevitably hurt Camilla, because the clarity replaced an ambiguity that had been comfortable for her. In the weeks since the internal communication, the palace has managed the situation the only way it knows how to manage things like this: quietly, through administrative adjustments that require no public explanation, and with the expectation that everyone involved will keep the surface stable, regardless of what is happening beneath it. Camilla kept the surface. She continued her engagements, continued appearing at Charles's side, continued being queen in every visible sense of the word. What changed was invisible to those on the outside and completely legible to those on the inside. At a private dinner about 3 weeks after the communication, according to sources familiar with the event, Camilla told a close friend that Felipe had always known how to close a door without knocking. The sentence was said without apparent bitterness, according to those who were present. It was said with the recognition of someone who had spent decades within an institution and who understood through direct experience that the most effective doors are those that close silently. Philip's decree closed quietly, and the door that closed would not reopen. Charles lives with the outcome in a way that those around him describe as the particular kind of discomfort that occurs when a man recognizes that the right decision for the institution is not the same as the easiest decision for the family. He does not question the validity of the decree, but he is aware that that envelope, kept in a safe for 3 years, beyond the time it should have been opened, arrived at the wrong time in the most inevitable way. William carries something else. For the future king, Philip's decree is not just a resolution of a specific issue, it's a model. A grandfather who understood that the most consequential decisions are the ones you make when you still have enough clarity to do them well, and who then documents them in a way that survives your absence. William has spent years trying to build structures that protect the monarchy he will inherit from the ambiguities that produce the problems he observed throughout his life. Philip had done just that. With a single document, on a morning in March 2021, without a hearing and without an announcement. That's what William is learning to do. And your grandfather's decree is, in a sense, the best example he has of how to do it. Camilla remains queen. She will remain queen as long as Charles lives and as long as the title exists. But the decree permanently altered what comes after the title, what happens to the spaces and structures she had incorporated as part of her identity within the institution she entered when she married Charles. Philip had understood that this question needed an answer before the answer was necessary. He gave the answer. And the envelope was closed for 3 years beyond its deadline because no one within that system wanted to be the person who opened it. But the lawyer, who was doing a routine review of property agreements, opened it without knowing what she was opening, in a file hallway that most palace staff know by number but rarely visit. And what was inside could not be closed back. To fully understand what Philip's decree represented, it is necessary to look at the broader context of how the crown residences function within the structure of the British monarchy, because without that context, the decree's impact appears smaller than it is. Crown residences are not simply large houses. They are the physical substrate of what it means to be a member of the royal family in an operational sense. It's where private family events take place. It's where birthdays are celebrated without cameras. It is where the family gathers on occasions that the official calendar does not record because they are not official occasions. It's where children play in hallways that have portraits on the walls, where adults have breakfast before heading out to work as public figures, where the conversations that shape decisions happen because there is no one but family present. For Camilla, access to these spaces was not just convenient. It was an integral part of what it means to be queen consort in the sense that she had built over 20 years within the family. A queen consort who does not have access to the crown's residences is a queen consort who exists on paper but not in the physical space where the monarchy actually lives. This distinction between existing on paper and existing in space is more significant than it seems when stated in abstract terms. Philip understood this. This is why the decree specifically addressed residences and not some other dimension of royal spouse status. He identified the control point that mattered most, and it is over this control point that he exercised the only authority he had available to someone in his position. The authority to document an intention in a way that would survive his death. The decree also reveals something about how Philip saw the difference between marriage and the institution. He was someone who had navigated this distinction with a particular sophistication throughout his entire adult life. He had entered the monarchy as the spouse of whoever occupied the throne, not as a member of the bloodline. He had built his position within an institution that had not been created to accommodate him comfortably. And he had done this without ever losing sight of the difference between what he was personally and what the institution was institutionally. This distinction, maintained with precision over 70 years, is what allows someone to write such a decree without it appearing cruel. Philippe wasn't being cruel to Camilla. I was being precise about something that the institution needed to be precise. The cruelty, if there is cruelty anywhere in this story, is not in the intent of the decree, but in the fact that the ambiguity it resolved had allowed expectations to develop that should never have developed in the way they did. This is the most difficult question that the decree raises, and it is a question that no one within that system is willing to answer publicly. Who knew, and when, that Camilla's expectations about the residences were developing in a way that conflicted with what the decree would eventually make explicit? Charles knew. He was the husband. He was present in conversations about residencies, about long-term planning, about what would happen after he was no longer in the picture. He had participated in these conversations, according to sources close to the situation, in a way that had not explicitly encouraged them, but also had not explicitly corrected them. This omission, not saying there was an outstanding issue that could change expectations, is the part of the story that makes it harder to assign responsibility cleanly. William probably knew that there were outstanding issues regarding residences, although not necessarily that the decree existed. He had been involved in discussions about the royal family's long-term planning since he inherited the Duchy of Cornwall, and these discussions inevitably touch on questions of who goes where and when after his death. Assignments. The existence of an unresolved issue in this area was something that a person in William's position, with the attention he pays to questions of structure and precedent, would have noticed. Anne had certainly thought about the question. Her observation that Philip had understood the need before anyone else was willing to look at it suggests that she had recognized the issue without having done anything about it, and that she recognized in Philip the willingness to act that she had noticed absent in others. What is left after all this is a constellation of people who knew, or could have known, that there was an unresolved tension, who did not resolve it for reasons that each of them could articulate in different ways, and who were then confronted with the resolution of a man who had simply acted when other options seemed unavailable or inconvenient. Camilla is living with the consequences of not being informed about an open issue. Charles is living with the consequences of not reporting. William is living with the legacy of a decision a grandfather made to protect the institution he will one day lead. And Anne is living with the recognition that the precision she admired in Philip has produced a result that is both institutionally correct and humanly painful, and that these two things are not contradictory, even if they are difficult to hold at the same time. Philip's decree was not the only document he left behind, but it was the one that had the most immediate consequences for the people living within the structures he spent his life helping to build and protect. And the fact that it sat in a safe for 3 years beyond the time it should have been opened says something about the collective reluctance of anyone within this family to be the first to take this kind of issue and deal with it directly. The lawyer who found him wasn't looking for him. I was doing a routine review of property agreements. There was no intention behind the discovery, just the ordinary process of someone doing their job carefully enough to notice when something they find is more significant than it should be. This is also something that Philippe had understood about how institutions work. The most consequential things are sometimes discovered not by people looking for them, but by people who are simply doing their jobs right. He filed the decree in accordance with correct procedures, in a place where it could be found by someone making a proper review of the records. He didn't hide it, it didn't destroy it. He filed it correctly and trusted that the ordinary administrative process would eventually find it. You trusted, right? 3 years overdue, but okay. The envelope was opened, the decree was read, and the issue that Felipe had resolved on a morning in March 2021 became real for the people he had anticipated would need to deal with on a Tuesday afternoon in 2025 through a lawyer who arrived early and left late, and who probably did not imagine when she accepted that routine review that she would be the one to open what Felipe had closed. There is a final dimension to this story that deserves attention, and it concerns what the decree reveals about the type of power that exists within a monarchy for those who understand how to use it correctly. Philip was not the king. It never was. He spent 70 years next to the throne without ever sitting on it. This position, which for some people would have been a source of ongoing frustration, was for him a form of authority other than formal monarchical authority. He understood the institution from an angle that monarchs rarely have access to, the angle of someone who is inside but not at the center, someone who sees how things work without being responsible for making them work. This angle produced a particular understanding of where the institution's vulnerability is located, not on the issues that make the headlines, not on the crises that the palace manages publicly, but on the issues that no one is willing to resolve, because resolving them would require someone to say something uncomfortable to someone they care about or owe loyalty to. Felipe did not have this problem. He had spent 70 years cultivating the freedom to say uncomfortable things when he believed they needed to be said. Not in a cruel way, not in a public way, but in a direct and documented way when the situation demanded it. The decree was the final version of that provision, applied to an issue that he had identified as potentially problematic and that no one else had yet addressed. William is learning to use similar power, not through direct inheritance from Philip, but through observation over years of how decisions that shape institutions are made by people who understand the difference between power for evil and real power. Formal power comes from the title. Real power comes from understanding where structures need to be strengthened before they buckle under the weight of what was not anticipated. Philip anticipated. William is anticipating. And the decree that remained in a safe for 3 years beyond its deadline is the most concrete record of how this anticipation works when someone has the discipline to act on it before it is too late to act. Camilla is living inside a structure that was partially redesigned by a man who died before she could respond to the redesign. This is uncomfortable in a way that goes beyond the practical. It's uncomfortable because it highlights that the institution she entered when she married Charles is not just governed by people who are alive. It is also governed by the decisions that people who died made while they were still capable of making them. Philip took his, and the envelope he kept in a safe in Windsor arrived on a lawyer's desk 3 years later than it should have, on a Tuesday morning, through the most ordinary process imaginable. Someone doing a routine review, checking to see if the records match up, doing their job carefully enough to notice when something isn't where it should be. The monarchy survives not because it is glamorous. It survives because from time to time, someone inside does its job right. And when that happens, the things that needed to be found are found. And the questions that needed answering receive the answer that someone took care to prepare before leaving. Philip left. The decree remained. And what remained is now in force in a way that he did not live to see, but that he had predicted, with a precision that 3 years later seems almost inevitable.